Welcome everyone, welcome to Kadha, where we believe that everyone has an amazing story, and what an amazing story we have for you today. With us today we have Rowen Thomas. Rowen, thank you so much for making the time to be with us. It's an honor to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Rowen is a PhD student at the University of Northern Colorado, currently focused on their dissertation. They also, during their copious free time, hold several jobs, including educational consultancy, being a motivational speaker, the co-owner of a tutoring and curriculum development firm, and an interpersonal coach. So needless to say, Rowan keeps themselves extremely busy. Now, one of the things that the whole world is focused on right now is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as I was talking to Rowan about this, they corrected me and gave me a new term to focus on. It's called JEDI, which stands for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I mean, I love this. I'm a geek at heart, and JEDI is just so up my alley. So JEDI it is. Thank you, Rowan.
I love that. I'm so glad I could share that with you. I nerded out too. I was like, yes, the geek in me was very excited.
Rowan, so here we are with Rowan. Rowan is a part of the transgender community. A few months ago, I happened to have sort of the luck, if you will, or the opportunity to listen to a talk hosted by Rowan. Rowan was being interviewed by a racial justice community known as Malayalis for Black Lives, and I just happened to hear that. And by listening to Rowan's talk, I realized that my so-called awareness of the issues affecting the transgender community was close to zero. I also realized that, everything that I thought and assumed to be, my sense of like how to include other communities was also limited. So it's an incredible honor to have Rowan here to not only share their journey, but also to keep us honest about what it is that we know and what it is that we do not. So once again, thank you, Rowan. It's an honor to have you here.
Yes, I'm so excited. And I love that line about helping us to learn what we know and what we don't know. I like to say that I'm a lifelong learner, so the more I learn, the less I know. And the further and further I've gotten in my graduate school studies, the more I can confirm that is true.
That is so true. That is so true. So, Rowan, maybe we can start with a little bit about your own journey. Could you share some of it with us today?
Yeah, so a little bit about me. So I currently, like you mentioned, I go to school at the University of Northern Colorado. I started my PhD program there in 2016, so about 5 years ago. I moved here from Texas, which is where I'm originally from. My parents immigrated to the States in '86. So first gen American, very much straddling cultures, growing up in the South, growing up in, a multi-generational home with my parents and my paternal grandparents, close to a lot of my cousins, the kind of typical big Indian community, but then we also lived in the part of Houston that was really predominantly white, so it was a very complicated and interesting growing up experience that I think really shaped me into who I am today. It took a long time for me to, I think, embrace a lot of the racial and cultural aspects of myself, whether that is related to justice or not, just whether that's in personal acceptance or, moving beyond that. But I think it's been a really, recent development sometime in the past 6 or 7 years that I have really, I think, been more intentional about wanting to reconnect with my community, specifically with our Malayali community, because I think that we need to have a lot of conversations, and there's a lot of really valuable values, and priorities that my parents, I think, instilled in me that are valuable to our community, like a sense of communalism, and not individualism, and a sense of justice. My parents honestly are the reason that I am so passionate about justice these days, whether they realize it or are willing to take the credit or not, because they always told me, that they came to the United States so that I would have opportunities and access, that I would be able to do more than they have the opportunity, that I would have more freedom and more access to do things. And so that was a very common repetition that was said to me, in early childhood, that I feel like really, really made me aware that people make decisions to try and find things that are better for their communities, for their families, and that, really trying to see that in all communities and bring that empathy, that I think trying to consider the position that families and parents and communities put themselves in to be able to get their kids to do the things they couldn't do. So sometimes it's ironic, I think, because maybe if I hadn't had those conversations with my parents or, been raised in the United States, maybe I would have grown up differently, maybe not. but I definitely think that it was a huge part of, just why I've always been so impassioned for justice. I've been like this since I was a kid. I've always been very outspoken, and when things aren't fair, I definitely want to make sure that we're calling attention to that and addressing it. And it definitely took me a while to get to that place of self-honesty and admitting when I don't know things. But I think that once you embrace that not knowing is so much a part of the learning journey as knowing is, I think it becomes a lot easier to be humble when you learn and accept knowledge that you don't have, that you can recognize you don't have. So that's so important. But it's not a thing that just happens like that overnight. It was not easy for me to really get that way. So yeah, so that's a little bit about myself, a little bit about my journey. I don't know if maybe I can talk more about school or work, but yeah, that's that's a little bit about me, my childhood.
That's awesome. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on how you discovered that you belonged to the transgender community.
Yeah.
What that discovery process was like, and how did you then, one, self-acceptance, like you mentioned, right? Like the honesty, and but then also how did you then help others in your immediate circle, if you will, right? Accept as well as come along for the journey.
Yeah, so it was interesting with gender. I actually, relatively speaking, maybe not for some folks, but relative to like Gen Zers, who I think are incredibly self-aware, and have done a lot of advanced identity work in their youth, right? I had a very late bloom, sort of, I think, with gender in particular. I have always known, like, my orientations, my sexuality has always been, very open and fluid. That is something I've always been aware of. But it wasn't until my senior year of college / my first year of my master's program. So it was like 2014, right? It wasn't that long ago. When I really actually started to explore the potentiality of the idea that I may be transgender, that I might not be cisgender. My whole life I have not particularly, so I was raised a woman, and I've never particularly fit into that stereotypical mold. At least that's how I would have described it growing up, or or in another way I could say it, I didn't have any regard for gender roles is probably a more accurate way of saying it. All of my cousins were mostly guys, and so we, hung outside and jumped off trees and scraped our knees and, we're skateboarding and all that kind of stuff. So it was very much, I was a, tomboy. And even just in how I showed up in extracurriculars, like I did speech and debate. I was the speech and debate president my junior and senior year. I competed nationally, like ranked nationally in the top 10 when I graduated high school. Like I was a very aggressive person. And I think I still am to some degree, but it was never sort of I never had a problem with my gender. I felt like the world had a problem with my gender. It wasn't my issue, So it never really felt like a problem I had to solve or something I needed to focus my attention on. So honestly, for most of my life, that was sort of where I was. I lived in a liminal space of gender, but still very much situated in womanhood as I defined it, right? When I was in college when I started college, was the first time I went to therapy, and because you can get free access to therapy in college, and I started seeing a therapist just for other unrelated, not at all gender things, just managing my own depression and anxiety and the first time living on my own and all that stuff, and going through relationships for the first time. And so it was through years of therapy, 2 or 3 years of therapy. I had a few friends and former partners who were trans and were coming out around that time. So, I was part of the LGBT club on campus. And so I knew a lot of folks in the community. Ironically, I actually grew up with a friend at my high school who was a year older than me, who is a trans guy who's Chinese, who transitioned while we were in high school. And so it was never something that was out of my mind per se. I obviously had awareness of the community, a very close interaction with the community in many ways, but it never occurred to me that would matter, that could be relevant to me, right? I always saw it as an external thing. It just didn't cross my mind to even consider that. And then as I was sort of, as the more you surround yourself with people who are finding freedom and exploring their gender, the more you think, well, there's got to be something to this. What is happening? And I've struggled with mental health issues my entire life. I can very vividly remember my first existential crisis when I was 11. I was in 5th grade. I just vividly remember waking up in bed and just feeling the dread of existence. And it wasn't until I actually started exploring that gender did not have to be prescriptive, or that I could actually reconsider the gender that was given to me, so to speak. And it sort of was a light bulb moment. I ended up spending a year, so I transitioned, and the first year I was using he, him pronouns and transitioned to male. And after the end of the year, I told my therapist, I feel like I cut myself out of one box only to sew myself into another. And so I was so confused and so frustrated. I was also really upset at the time because my partner, who was also trans, as she was progressing in her journey, becoming more only attracted to women and not masculine presenting people, and I am like exploring my gender but finding out that masculinity and maleness isn't really my gender either. And so I'm in this kind of state of flux and confusion, and also the rejection of like, this isn't really who I want to be, but I'm still trying to figure it out, but it's not who you need. So so it's just very complicated and hard, but it was worth it because, coming out of the end of it feeling like, okay, I don't have to put myself into a box. I don't have to fit neatly into a category. I can find and try out pronouns that work for me. So, usually with people I trust, people who are close to me in personal context, trying out different pronouns to see how they work and adjusting and just really feeling how it lands with people, with me and really just following my intuition and listening more to my body and my feelings and my emotions and how they show up with me rather than prioritizing the consideration of the comfort of others or the understanding of others or even just the language or familiarity of others, right? Because it really is about, am I going to share this information and deprioritize their convenience and comfort? Or am I going to prioritize myself and, I'm the one who has to go to sleep with me at the end of the day and wake up to me every morning. So I decided to follow the path that really, that gives me peace and gives me a sense of self that I really can feel is authentic and genuine and is not hiding any part of myself or pretending to be something that I'm not or trying to be something that other people want me to be. So, yeah.
That's incredible. I wish more people would do that. It takes a lot of courage. And like you said, you're at the other end, right? Like you're here to say that it can be done.
Yes. And to your question about how did I support folks, I didn't even talk about that. I got really caught up in the feelings. But so I said I was just finishing my undergrad when I started sort of exploring gender privately, in my personal life. And I didn't actually come out in a public way until I was well into my first year of my master's program. So I did my master's program at the same university that I did my undergrad. So my undergrad was in philosophy and my master's was in college student development with an emphasis in LGBTQ studies and Title IX policy administration. And I worked with our vice president for student affairs. I was working with her as her, GA, and she was, it was really our relationship and her sort of seeing the spark of advocacy in me. We actually met have you ever heard of the program called It's on Us? It's like the college program that's sort of like anti-sexual violence, and it sort of organizes folks to change the culture of rape to a culture of consent, right? So they were having an event for that. She was hosting it, and it was a very cis, women, straight focused event. And me and my friend were there, and I was writing notes because I had a lot of critiques about what was going on. And when the Q&A section happened, my hand went up and I had all of these questions and comments. And, she came up afterwards at the event to me and offered me a job. She was just like, wow. You are really bringing some much needed criticism and development to our strategy. We clearly have a blind spot in this area. Please come work for me and we can do this on all the stuff I do across campus.
Wow.
And so it was through that opportunity that I had the access to be able to advocate at the time. So things that I did, so I was in the process of legally changing my name and my gender marker. I went through the process of helping my university overhaul their online system so that they could have the tech patches to be able to not use legal names when people didn't want those names used, to be able to use appropriate gender and pronoun, to be able to put those names on class rosters, on diplomas. So they actually reissued my bachelor's degree with my chosen name. And so it was just a really unexpected and powerful moment because it was kind of, it had been brewing for me personally for a few years, and I hadn't really felt comfortable, safe, brave enough to share it until this point, and I didn't expect the outpouring of support that I got, especially institutionally, especially policy-wise. To give a little context, my alma mater is St. Edward's University, a small Catholic private liberal arts university in Austin, Texas. So just to give a little context, it was really unexpected, but also at the same time it was really powerful, and they're very justice focused at that institution, and so social justice is a part of their mission. That's why I went there. But yeah, it started there and it just hasn't stopped.
That's incredible. And in some ways, perhaps you are lucky too, right?
Absolutely.
To have that support.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. So what was the most challenging part, right? Not just for you, but also for the transgender community. What is the most challenging part of your journey?
I think it's good. This is a very hard question. I think to try and put it succinctly, if I was only to choose one, I think the idea that understanding anything about trans people or trans issues, whatever field or discipline you're in, right? Whether you're a healthcare provider or just a customer service representative or a teacher or whatever, right? I think the challenge that I really know pushes against trans people everywhere and that I've had to experience so often is this idea that understanding of trans people or trans issues is this specialty topic that only certain people know about, and that only certain people can wrap their brains around, so to speak, when really it's about respect. Honestly, it comes down to respect. If I respect someone, I am going to listen to them about what they say about themselves. End of story, right? If someone tells me this is the name I go by, whether they're trans or not, I'm not gonna ignore what they tell me and call them by a different name. That's so rude and disrespectful. And that's all it is, right? Not even talking about the complexities of gender or sexuality. It is just bottom line human decency and respect. That's all it's about. And I think that is the challenging thing that trans people face, is that they don't receive basic human dignity or respect because people believe that in order to treat them with that, they have to have a degree in gender studies, right? Which they do not, absolutely do not. They just have to have, like you, an interest, right? A compassion or passion, and a willingness to admit when you have gaps, right? That's it. Like that honesty with self and others, and that willingness to learn, like that's it. I think that that's a real thing that especially I think the healthcare community is a really great example of that. It really is illustrative of that. A lot of healthcare providers and professionals who don't have a familiarity with trans people, trans bodies, will say, "Oh, you are a trans person. I can't treat you. Go see an endocrinologist."
Oh no!
And you may have heard this in the video with the Malaysia Black Lives, right? That happened to me in Boulder, 2 years ago, not even that long ago, and Boulder, Denver, Colorado, supposed to be a very trans accepting place, yeah. And usually they'll say, "Oh, you need to go see an endocrinologist," and it's like, no. Because I am trans, it does not mean that my health care is so significantly different. Like, the hormones that trans people regulate artificially are the same hormones that all other people have in their body, that cis people at different parts of their life cycle also have to regulate artificially. It's really surreal how otherized the trans community can be, and in such innocuous ways, because I think it's often under the guise of, well, I don't know, I'm going to do a bad job, so I just won't try, right? Like, I'm not a trans expert, so I'm just not going to do it, right? But I think that is more harmful in and of itself, because then it just says everyone can't be a part of accepting the trans community. Only certain people can be.
I recently had this aha moment.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to this black lady.
Mm-hmm.
She joined our team. And I was, everybody was like, "We're excited to have you here. We can do more as it pertains to equity, and, really excited to get your perspective." And I had to, I was talking to her one-on-one, and I said, "Can we keep that whole gender and equity part aside? Because I want to say something to you as a person."
Mm-hmm.
I love the fact that you don't care what other people think as much about, when it comes to expressing your opinion,
yeah.
You care about them.
Right.
And for a moment, she was taken aback. She was like, I'm like, no, I'm just saying you as a person. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to say that without all the other tags that are associated with you. And I wonder if some of this, resistance, if you will, comes from fear.
Absolutely.
How do we help people get past that fear?
Yeah. That is a hard one. I think it really depends on where that fear is based, right? And I think finding the root of that fear is the really important thing. But I think the other thing is that, we can't help people get over their fears if they're not willing to get over their fears. We can't push them across the bridge, so to speak.
That's true.
But if they're willing, right, to explore the roots, and if they're willing to own the mistakes. I think that the thing that it's not easy, It's not an easy ask of people. It's not a simple thing to do. It's not a checklist. It's not, a quiz you can just take and finish. It's a lot of really deep, hard self-work, and it's a lot of owning up to mistakes and admitting to when you are part of a problem, even if you didn't realize the problem was there, right? And really taking responsibility for that in a way that is not prioritizing your own guilt or feelings of remorse, but is, transforming those into action and justice, right? And so I think it's really about doing some deep personal emotional exploration and figuring out, what am I so afraid of, or what have people told me, or what have my communities told me that I need to be afraid of? I think the other thing, I hate this, but it's true. I think just meeting and listening to trans people, talking to us and hearing about us and seeing that we do things like our teachers, and we have normal jobs, and we grow up to be normal adults who deal with normal bills, and we pay taxes, and we're just boring old people. But that's that would be the ideal.
I love what you just said. I think most problems in the world, right, most issues, as we call it, a lot of the work starts within each individual.
I agree. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's spot on. So I'm going to use the term you gave me, JEDI.
Yes.
How do you envision sort of the JEDI efforts evolving in the next couple of years? I think the world is awakening a little bit, given all of the issues that have been surfacing, and sort of looking, stepping back a little bit and looking at it, going, what do we need to do? So from your standpoint, how do you think the JEDI efforts are going to evolve, and what would be most beneficial in the short term to help with that evolution?
I love that, because I think this is something that I'm making some live connections right now, but I'm gonna try and connect the divinity of what things should be in my mental health experiences growing up. This idea that I have always felt that change has been coming since I was a kid. I have felt that something very intense, an intense paradigmatic shift would be happening in my life, in my lifetime, right? That I would be able to witness and be a part of that. And so to grow up to be the adult that actually does get to live that, one, wow, it's way more intense than I thought it would be. And two, it is so much more difficult and complex. And so I think, to me, the two things that come to my mind the most are empathy and restorative justice. I think that empathy, like we've talked about, right, that self-work is such a huge part of how to progress the interpersonal work and the systemic work and the institutional work, the policy work. And I think that our conception of justice as a nation who sets the policy tone, whether we will, be culpable to it or not internationally to some degree, and we have this really warped sense of justice, officially in our legal system, that is absolutely, rooted in our racist, colonialist, imperialist history, that we just don't want to talk about. We're not willing to admit how deeply connected to all the other systems. It is like to healthcare, like to schools, and I think restorative justice, if you're not familiar, is for listeners who are not familiar, right? It's a practice of justice that's not vengeful or retributive justice, right? But it centers the people who were wronged or the families of the victims who were wronged if they're unable to advocate for themselves any longer. And it relies on sort of restorative healing techniques that are grounded in communities of color that really takes the onus and responsibility of what does justice mean for that person, and how does justice come to be about for the person who did the wrong, right? And so often the outcomes are not only transformative for the individual who committed the crime, but the families of the victims, but of the community, because it allows people to really actually take control and understand the situation and have empathy for what are the circumstances that led this person to do this thing, what are the ramifications of the things that may happen to them, and really what does the people who have been affected, what do they actually want to happen to that person, right? And most of the time, it's not spending life in prison without parole. It's not solitary confinement. It's not, it's not spending the best years of their lives locked up for something that they may or may not have done, right? Or that they did when they were under 18, or any of those things, right? Or that they did that is legal in some states and not legal in others, right? I'm looking at you, marijuana. But so I think just that shift of justice and understanding that we have to be a part of that too. It's our system. We have to take a little bit of responsibility for it, at least for why it stayed the same. We may not have created it, but we sure as hell didn't change it.
You are doing a lot of work to not just, help people relate, but also to spread awareness and make it more mainstream, like you said, right? Like, this is not a new thing. It's not something that people have to now go learn about. Just be open and just accept things the way they are, I think, in very simplistic terms. How do you envision expanding the work that you're doing to continue to raise awareness and support sort of the transgender community?
Yeah, so much of the advocacy work I do a lot of, development, teaching, learning kind of stuff, but I also try to do a lot of advocacy work, and my favorite thing is I love to get trans people paid. So I do a lot of work where we're getting community feedback and advisory. So for example, I don't know if you're familiar with the community advisory boards, right? It's something that healthcare businesses use a lot of. And so I do a lot of advocacy around trying to prioritize funding for groups like that, to prioritize paying them not just minimum wage, right? To pay them for their time, because it's not synthesizing those experiences and giving feedback on policy and procedure. Like, that is some complex stuff that you're asking people to do, And so I think that's one of the things, is just really like very tangibly community oriented, is trying to put power and money back into the hands of trans people. And so a big part of that, my cooperative, IME Mentors, we are a queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, POC owned, led organization. So all of the members of our cooperative, all 5 of our members now, are either queer, trans, people of color, or both. and so it's definitely something that I try to do just in every action that I take, is work with elevating and empowering the voices of people who don't have power, and really sticking it to people who do, and telling them the things that maybe the people around them aren't willing to tell them. what I usually say about my public speaking is that, bring me to your campus so that I can say the things to your leaders that you can't, that would get you fired, because that's what I want to do. I want to be that person who shakes things up and who calls people out on their shit, because stuff needs to change, and complacency and complicitness and thoughts and prayers are going to do nothing. Action and advocacy are really going to do something. And I think one of the things about what you said is just that being open. And I think the thing I would add to that is, you can be open and respectful to things you don't understand. You don't have to understand something or someone or a piece of somebody to be respectful of them, I don't have to understand a language to respect someone speaking in a different language, It's that's maybe a very simplistic example, but I think that's what it is. It's the fear of not knowing, which then leads to judgment and guilt. A lot of times repress guilt and shame about whatever they're not exploring in their own personal lives. I find that that phrase, thou doth protest too much, really applies to people who are very transphobic, that they wish that they had a little bit more gender freedom. They may not be trans, but I think a lot of cisgender people wish that they had the freedom to be more expressive in their gender in a different way with less judgment, And I think that that's absolutely normal, because these are just artificial constructs that we've backed ourselves into, and it's like, it hurts, but I have to stay here. And it's just, but why? You really don't. And so to me, it's also about just like elevating, I think, our consciousness around gender and just the limitations we put on ourselves, and how we can kind of free ourselves from those. So,
As you were talking, I was reminded of an artist, right? There's a canvas, and it's up to you, the strokes, the brush strokes, if you will. And that's what brings out the beauty, because it's an expression of the self. And I think that's what you're saying. That's beautiful. Rowan, I have to say, I've been so inspired just listening to you. I want to help. I want to do as much as I can. But let's jump in quickly to the last question here. You're part of the One Thing series, and so this is I have to ask this question, which is, what is the one thing that you want to share from your experience to help us treat the transgender community in an inclusive manner?
Every trans person you meet is not there for your emotional labor on how you process your journey around gender. Hire me. Hire another trans person who does this professionally, right? We do it for our work, right? There are those of us you can find, but every trans person you meet in the wild, just like every black person you meet, or every brown person you meet, or every disabled person you meet, right, is not the voice of their community and should not automatically be assumed to be the advocate, right? You as a person with privilege and power should take on the role of advocate, right? Of speaking with, not for, those communities, but actually putting yourself out there, right? Because to think that only trans people can be advocates for themselves or for trans rights, I think is part of the problem, And so I think just that emotional labor piece and take on that torch, of advocacy yourself, that you have power and you have privilege if you're not a trans person to be able to advocate with and for the trans community. And so, do that. Take that power on.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rowan. One last thing.
Yes, absolutely.
You are, where can people find out more about the work that you're doing? And is there a website?
Yes.
How do we find out more?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me online at rowensconsulting.com. That's ROWENS consulting, CONSULTING.com. I'm also on Facebook at Rowan's Consulting. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at MixRowen, MXROWEN. You can find my co-op at imementors.com. Gotta plug the co-op. I love them. They support me in all that I do, even though I'm an overcommitter. And they love and nourish that. And yeah.
Excellent.
So
that's the information I was looking for. Thank you. Thank you,
Perfect.
Rowan. This was fantastic. Really appreciate you being here. Me too. This is exciting.
Great.
So thank you for being here and
Absolutely.
for helping us learn more. And we will take all of the suggestions that you provided to heart. And once again, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thanks everyone for joining in. That's it from Kadha for today. Signing off. Bye-bye.